So in this final video, we're going to pick up exactly where we left off the previous video and consider those final two ggplot2 elements that I've mentioned previously, which are facets and themes. So if you remember, we got as far as making this lovely plot with the pulse dataset. We had income mapped to the y-axis, we had age group mapped to the x-axis, we set different colors for different age groups, we made the geometry box plot, and then we modified our fill aesthetic using the Brewer modifier and gave it this nice dark 2 palette, which is my personal favorite. And we also put the y-axis on a logarithmic scale. So this gave us a nice clear plot showing us that among those aged 45 to 54, this seems to be where we have the highest income when we look at the distributions, and then it kind of curves up and then curves down with age. So throughout this video, I'm now going to be asking a slightly different question, which is we've got this nice data set, so let's start thinking about maybe whether there is a relationship between someone's political view and their income. Stereotypically, I guess we would assume that people who are more conservative perhaps would be earning more money than those who are more liberal. Let's see what the data says about that. And up till this point, we've only been looking at age group as a factor related to income. So the first thing that we probably want to do here is change this plot, and instead of looking at age group, we look at political view, which is another one of the columns in our data set. And this is one of the best tricks you will ever learn when you are learning R, which is copy and paste. Because I've made this quite nice plot, 90% of it is already written for this new plot that I want to make, which is political view. So I take my code, I copy it, I paste it, I replace the word age group with political view, and hey, look at that, I've got a nice plot immediately. And here, when I'm looking at this plot, I may be a little bit surprised initially, because I would have been expecting to see perhaps a bigger difference between my three boxes here. The median is a little bit lower for liberals as compared to moderates and conservatives, but not really that different. And then this gets me thinking, okay, we've already seen there's definitely a relationship between age and income. And again, stereotypically, we might think there's going to be a relationship between age and political view. So it could be there's a confounding effect going on here in the relationship between income and political view. Maybe we need to think about a way of plotting all three of these variables at the same time. But let's start out with my assumption that I just made, because this is a good excuse to try something we've not really seen so far. Because if we're trying to consider, okay, does age have a relationship with the political view? What kind of plot are we going to make to look at that relationship? Because age and political view, in our data, both of these are categorical variables. We've got age group rather than age as a number. So if we're thinking of how we can create a plot, there's a few different options we can make, but probably the most obvious would be to make bar charts. And this is where we are going to use geom_bar rather than geom_col. So earlier we've seen the use of geom_col, and this is where we want to make what gets called column plots, but this is where we have an x and a y value that we are making our bars from. But with geom_bar, this is where we're going to have a summary of our variables. So our y-axis by default in geom_bar is a frequency count. So we don't have to map a y-aesthetic when we create a geom_bar. We only need as a minimum an x-aesthetic. In this particular plot that I've just made here quickly, I'm using an x-aesthetic for age group. I'm also adding the fill aesthetic for political view. And you can see what this does by default is it gives us a stacked bar chart. So we've got our different age groups along our x-axis, and then we have a little blue bit for conservatives, then a green bit for moderates, and then a red bit for liberals. And one of the things which is jumping out to me here from this stacked bar chart, probably the first thing you notice is, there's a lot more older people, age 65 plus, than there are in any of the other age categories. That's maybe not surprising since that's the widest age category by far. There's people in their 90s in this survey, so that's covering about 30 years worth of people, and all the others are 10 years or even less than 10 years for the youngest age group. So it's hard at the moment to necessarily make an easy comparison of whether we've got more conservatives who are older versus more liberals who are younger. We kind of need to do something else to this plot to see that particular pattern. And this is where we can use the position argument within geom bar. So the default is to have those stacked bar charts, but if we use the position equals fill, then what that does is it standardizes all of our bars to the same height. And then we can see the proportion of people within each of the groups on our x-axis within each of the categories of our fill aesthetic. So we can see here, if we look at going along, the proportion of conservatives is slowly increasing as we increase our age group from about a quarter in our youngest age group up to about a third in our oldest age group. And we've got almost a mirror effect for liberals, starting with about a third for our youngest age group, going down to about a quarter by our oldest age group, and the moderates is staying about the same all the way through. This is something which is kind of worth highlighting because I don't really like how they're using the word fill to mean more than one thing here, because we've got fill as an aesthetic here, and we've also got fill as a position here. These aren't actually related, it's just using the same word in a completely different context. So position equals fill is something which we're only setting within geom bar, and this is about getting this proportional bar chart rather than the stacked bar chart. But the fill aesthetic is something which is common to all kinds of different geometries. So with that particular piece solved to a certain extent, we can see there is some kind of relationship going on here between age and political view. Let's now get back to my main overall question of, okay, what's the relationship between the political view and income? And how can we bring in age to this? And this is where there's this really nice feature within ggplot2 for adding facets. And there's a couple of different ways we can add facets, but the most important and probably the most useful is the function facet_wrap. And so we can use facet wrap here with age group, and this will give us one different panel for each of our 6 age groups, and then within each panel we've got boxes for all of our 3 political views. And so this function works a little bit differently to how we've seen so far within facet_wrap. Within that function we need to use this squiggly line and then the name of the variable that we want to set for our different panels. So that squiggly line, it's called a tilde. It gets used quite a lot in R. So if you don't know where it is on your keyboard, I would suggest learning where it is on your keyboard, because you're going to need to use it quite a lot. Like every different country's language puts it in a slightly different place, so it can be a little bit awkward. It's not something you use on a day-to-day basis too much. So looking at our plot now, this is actually telling us something a bit more interesting than our original one. If we look at our 3 youngest age groups, it seems that in all 3 of those, the conservative political view, there is evidence there that we've got higher incomes. The distribution is raised a little bit. And then also for the moderates within that 35 to 44 age group, that's a little bit higher than the liberals in terms of the incomes that we're seeing. But then for our 3 older age groups, there's really not much difference at all. The boxes look more or less the same for all 3 political views when we've got the over 45 and the 55 and 65. So when we get to this plot, we also have to think carefully about, okay, what is going where? Because we could have switched around here age group and political view, and it would have given us exactly the same information, but the way it would have presented it would have made it much more difficult to see those trends. Because here, if we stare at this plot, it's not really intuitive, that result that we just saw. Yes, the boxes are still there, they're still showing exactly the same information, but we wouldn't be able to pick out that result at all clearly. So we need to think carefully about how to put this together to get the information and tell the story that we're trying to uncover here. So with our age group and our political view, we could probably have anticipated in advance that what we're interested in is comparing political views within an age group. So that means we're going to want to have the political view as the X variable and the age group as the facet variable. If we were interested in comparing within a political view what the effect of age is, then we'd have flipped it round. But our brain wouldn't have initially gone to that way of thinking as a way of trying to answer this particular question. So I think what I've done is quite interesting. I now want to start sharing this with people. And at the moment, there's probably not enough information here for me to just give this graph to somebody and they know what it means. I know what it means because I've worked through it. You hopefully know what it means because you've been following me work through it. But this is the point where we're now starting to add that extra information and think about some of the more fine-tuning, styling and labeling elements. And this is the final of those ggplot2 areas which I want to cover, which is theming. And related to theming, we've got labeling. So there's a nice function which is labs for labels. And if we use that function, we can set labels for our title, we can add a subtitle, and then we can label all of the aesthetics. So here I've just put in a title and a subtitle, and then I've got annual income as a Y label, political ideology as an X label. Even though I'm using the same variable, the political view variable, on my X-axis and my fill axis, I need to explicitly label those two aesthetics when I'm using this labs argument, this labs function, because otherwise it will just take the default, which is to just take the variable name. So I need to repeat the political ideology label for the X aesthetic and for the fill aesthetic so that it labels in both of those places. This labs function, it's fairly intuitive to work out how it works, I think. Again, we need to make sure we have quotation marks in the right place around all of the text that we want to appear on our labels here. And the final thing that I want to cover is how to change some of the extra elements. So there's some built-in themes to ggplot2, which are quite nice to change it in different ways. We can have a dark theme or a light theme, or we can have a theme which makes it look like it came from Excel. And there's lots of add-on libraries for all kinds of different themes that other people have written. There's one that makes everything look like it came from the opening titles to Star Wars, if that is what you so desire. I'm going to use, again, probably my favorite theme to use, which is theme light. And that works through the function theme_light. And again, if I'm happy with these default options, I can just open and close the brackets. If you look into the help menus and the documentation, more or less every single possible element of this chart you can fine-tune in some way, whether it's the font or the color or the size. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. There's some examples in the tutorial of modifying those different elements. But using these themes and even creating your own theme is really useful for giving a consistent, I guess, visual identity, especially if you're going to be making lots of graphs in the same presentation or the same article that you're writing, and you want to have everything looking nice and consistent alongside each other. You can start having this consistent theme which you're applying onto all of your plots so that they all look nice and that they all look consistent. So just to recap these key points, the facet is used when we're creating different panels for a unique group of a variable. So in the case that I was just using there, I was using age group for my facets, and I had a different panel for each age group. And always consider a little bit of trial and error when you're creating your plot. I didn't just write that final set of commands off the top of my head. I worked through this process that I've been filming through this video. I slowly added one step at a time. I tried things out, I changed it, I came back, and eventually I got to something which I was quite happy with. Going through this nice sequential process really helps getting you to that final end product. You're not always knowing where you're going in advance, so a bit of trial and error, especially with some of these fine-tuning elements of colors and fonts and sizes, you've got to make a few mistakes until you get to exactly the points that you want to get to. And then with the theming, you've got the theme functions. There's all kinds of these built-in theme functions. Again, just try around, look at what there is, see which ones you like, see which ones you don't like, add in some of the extra libraries to see how they work. And you've got that labs function, which lets you label the aesthetics. And it's always important to remember you're labeling the aesthetics rather than labeling the variables. So if you are using the same variable to more than one aesthetic, you're going to need to set more than one label. Okay, I think that's it for these videos on ggplot2. As ever, please make sure that you work through lots of examples here by yourself, because the best way of learning is not listening to me speak through this. The best way of learning is trying things out for yourself and really getting to grips with all these different elements of ggplot2, bringing them together in lots of fun ways. And I look forward to seeing all of the beautiful graphs that you end up making. Thanks.